This video is a sequel. Go watch the first.
Much like my first video about bootleg fighting games, I thought it would be really fun to ignore these games, the ones that are well made and have awesome graphics, and instead focus on these ones instead. Whether they're made by Taiwanese hacking groups, anonymous indie developers, or small Indian children in a Calcutta sweatshop, there's a lot of fun to be had with bootleg fighting games, and you never know what you're gonna get when you play one of these. Even though a lot of them are super jank, it's genuinely very impressive how these indie devs have learned how to code games for various systems, and I think it's awesome, so the purpose of this video is not to make fun of these games. I actually think most of them are pretty funny and entertaining despite their low production values. As a quick side note, I'm getting a lot of my information about these games from the Bootleg Games Wiki website, so full credit to this website for its contributions. Anyway, I've chosen 4 of these bootleg fighting games to explore for today's video, and they're pretty weird and wacky. Because I want my genuine reactions and thoughts to come through in the video, I'm purposely doing as little research as I can into these games, and I hope you have fun listening to me ramble about them. Alright, let's get into the very first game on the list. Released in 1998 for the Sega Genesis, the King of Fighters 98 is a Taiwanese bootleg of the actual King of Fighters 98, but unlike that game, this one features not only guest characters but also a horrible English translation. For starters, this game has 3 buttons. You have punch, kick, and block, so it's already totally different to the actual KOF games. If you press the buttons normally, they're light attacks, but holding back and pressing them will result in a heavy attack. It's a bit weird to have light and heavy moves function this way, but as the standard Genesis controller only had 3 buttons, I do understand why this is the case. As far as I can tell, there are also no throws in this game, so if your opponent has solid defense, it can be a nightmare trying to open them up. When your meter fills up, you can input a character-specific super move, but there's only one per character. Sorry Terry fans, but there's no Buster Wolf in this game, only Power Geyser. And speaking of Terry, he's actually called Shri in this game due to a catastrophically hilarious spelling error. Kami is also called Kunmi, and Robert is spelled Lobalt too. The incorrect names are honestly my favorite part of this whole game, and it'll never not be funny. Another thing I like about this game is its inclusion of motion inputs. I'm a big fan of jamming my stick all around and getting cool moves out in the game as a result, so having to do proper motion inputs is quite fun, at least in theory. While the game's input reading didn't give me a lot of trouble, it has horrifically bad hit detection, as some moves that you think would connect don't, and other moves that look like they should miss somehow do connect. Also, it's not a problem per se, but having to use a block button in a game based on the King of Fighters feels really weird, and I kept instinctually holding back to block, but this is just a me problem. All of this means that the game's combat is really unpredictable, and not in a fun way where every match is different and leads to exciting outcomes. Rather, this is just poorly made due to it being a legitimate Frankenstein's monster of stolen assets. Character sprites, backgrounds, audio, etc. have all been taken from actual fighting games, with Street Fighter and KOF being the obvious ones. Honestly, I can't fault the reused assets, as making brand new assets makes no sense for a game like this, and you'll see plenty more stolen assets later in the video too. Another thing I like about this game is that there's a decent amount of characters here. The left side is the main roster, and the right side is the Orochi variants. You know how a game like Persona 4 Arena Ultimax has the shadow characters that you can pick from? Think of the Orochi characters as really, really bad shadow characters. These guys not only have next to no special moves, but they also have much worse frame data, so there's really no reason to pick any of these guys. Orochi Guile, for example, only has 1 special move and 1 super, whereas the actual Guile has 2 specials and 1 super. Although I commend the developers for having different characters with specials taken from their source material, I just couldn't gel with the hit detection. Having Orochi characters be inferior palette swaps of the main cast to pad out the character roster is also a bit of a letdown, but there's only so many characters and modes you can fit into a Genesis cartridge after all. On the topic of modes, there are 2 of them in the game, versus multiplayer and arcade mode. There are no character endings or unlockables in this game, so you're forced to play it all over again with the same characters when you finish it. Aside from the funny character names and general madness of it all, there's little reason to keep coming back to this game, and the thrill does wear off pretty quickly. For a bootleg crossover fighting game, I was hoping the King of Fighters 98 would hold my interest for longer than it actually did, and while I'm extremely tempted to bring this game to locals and force people I know to play it with me, we'd probably move on to something else in an instant. Next up on the list is the crossover of the century. Virtua Fighter 2 vs Tekken 2, or VR Fighter vs Taken 2 on the title screen, is a 2D fighting game that was also developed in Taiwan, and as a side note, this main menu screen surely proves that video games are indeed a form of high art. Taken 2. If you couldn't tell by now, this game pits the characters of the second Virtua Fighter and Tekken games and makes them all fight each other. It has the same control scheme as the previous game, which makes sense considering that Virtua Fighter actually has a block button, but having to use it for the Tekken characters feels a bit blasphemous. Throws also don't make a return here, so having good defense and running out the clock can be crucial. Stages also don't have walls, meaning there are no corners, so if time is getting low and you've got the life lead, you can just backdash forever. Despite being a completely different game on the surface to King of Fighters 98, this game also feels pretty broken. Many attack strings don't connect properly, and the OTG attacks in actual Virtua Fighter also don't exist here. Get up kicks are here though, which is good, and this allows players to have an offensive wake-up option after being knocked down. As Virtua Fighter and Tekken are some of the most iconic 3D fighting games ever made, it's a shame that sidestepping isn't present in this game, but I totally understand why. I'm not even sure if it's technologically possible for such a mechanic to exist on the Genesis, and as the actual VF2 port to Genesis didn't include this feature, I'm not surprised that the bootleg version also doesn't include it. Before I forget, ring outs are also missing due to the infinite stages, so another crucial aspect of Virtua Fighter is nowhere to be found in this bootleg. Despite this game explicitly mentioning Virtua Fighter and Tekken in its name, it also features characters from Fighting Vipers, Sega's other 3D fighting game series. Barn and Honey are fully playable, although Barn has some character-specific quirks, just to put it lightly. According to the Bootleg Games website, Barn has these two moves with these motion inputs. Looks simple enough, right? The problem, however, is that due to the way the game's input detection was coded, you can never actually do these moves. The website states that hacking the game's ROM and changing the inputs allows you to perform them, but if you don't do this, these moves are impossible to perform, even if you do so with frame-perfect accuracy. I understand that this is a genuine problem with the game, but it makes me like it even more because of how stupid it is. As for the other characters, they each have a decent amount of special moves, having around 5 or 6 each on average. Like Virtua Fighter, the guard button is also used for some attacks, like Akira Strike, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce this name. I really like how the bootleg developers incorporated this feature into their game, even if it means inputting it on a pad is pretty tricky. Most inputs come out reliably enough for them to not be a problem, and characters have commands that match the moves from their original games. Heihachi's axe kick is forward C, Jun's double lift kick is down B plus C, and Kazuya's dragon uppercut is a DP motion and B. As mentioned before, the hit detection in this game is awful, but at least these moves are here. It was also good fun playing as Wolf, who's my favorite VF character, and even though he only has 4 listed special move commands on the Bootleg Games websites, it was still kind of fun using his physical strikes. Because throws aren't here, it means that none of Wolf's command grabs are in the game, and if you aren't very familiar with Virtua Fighter, Wolf Hawkfield is one of the coolest, most efficient, and downright stone-cold grapplers I've ever had the enjoyment of playing in a fighting game, so having none of his grabs here is a major shame. I speculate that the lack of throws in not only this fighting game, but a lot of Genesis bootleg fighters, now that I think about it, is due to an engine limitation, but I'm not 100% sure on this. The website also mentions that this game is seemingly the very first Genesis bootleg fighting game, so bootleg fighter developers wouldn't have figured out all the quirks of the system yet when this game came out. For the first Genesis bootleg fighter ever, this game isn't too bad. It's definitely far from being perfect, believe me, but seeing the characters from these two beloved fighting games meet is pretty cool, even if it's in an unofficial capacity. However, I haven't even gotten to the funniest part about this game yet. If you take a look at the game's online move list, you'll find the following. Leaping Sidekick. Does not make Kazuya leap. Moving on to a Nintendo console now, let's explore yet another crossover title. XMen vs Street Fighter is a downscaled version of the arcade classic to the Super Nintendo, but unlike the real version, this game is a one-on-one fighter. There are 8 characters here, with 2 of them, Psylocke and Iceman, being taken straight from X-Men Children of the Atom. These characters aren't in the actual XMen vs Street Fighter, so it's interesting to see that they specifically were included in this bootleg. As for the gameplay, I need you to say the magic words with me. This game has no throws. Also, you've been good so far, so I'll let you in on a little secret. Just lean in a little bit. Despite this being a port of a 6-button fighting game to a 6-button console, X-Men vs Street Fighter SNES only has 2 buttons. Punch and kick are your only attacks, although you can do special on super moves with motion inputs, which is nice. I mentioned just before that this is a one-on-one fighting game, and this is simultaneously surprising but also understandable. I severely doubt that the Super Nintendo would have had enough memory to seamlessly allow for fights with 4 different characters, even if this was an official port. If you've seen some of my Marvel vs Capcom related videos before, you'll know that I'm a big fan of Wolverine, so I immediately tried him out here. Upon playing the first 15 seconds of arcade mode, I literally said, "This is even more jank than the previous games," out loud to myself when I was recording game footage. I tried, Lord knows I tried, to get the hang of this game's control scheme, but I just couldn't. Due to there being 4 missing buttons when compared to the original release, all of the moves here feel really sloppy and imprecise, and the input reader can also feel a bit defective overall. I don't know if it's just me or my controller or the emulator, but I can't consistently get half the moves out in this game. I didn't think of it going in, but as this is supposed to be a home port of a legitimate fighting game as opposed to a random bootleg made in Taiwan, my expectations for this game are comparing it to the actual X-Men vs Street Fighter arcade game. Obviously that's the superior version, but I still find it cool and even a little bit endearing how a group of hackers got a version of the game running on the Super Nintendo, even if this game is pretty much on life support. In terms of content, this game also only has arcade and versus multiplayer, so it's pretty bare bones in this regard, but I expected as much going in. The appeal of this bootleg is that it's a really weirdo version of X-Men vs Street Fighter that runs on Nintendo hardware, and even though it's missing the tag feature and some of the original game's characters, or actually a lot of them, this version is still fun if you really love broken fighting games. What's really interesting about this game, however, is that when compared to other bootleg fighting games, this one is quite hard to get your hands on. Many versions of this game have copy protection, meaning that they won't run on emulators, and this gave me a headache when I was attempting to play the game. I feel the need to give a massive shout out to SNES hacker D4S for figuring out how to remove the game's copy protection. Without their work, I wouldn't have been able to play this game. As for how I found it, I can't give specific details, but it took me the better part of 30 minutes to find a working version of this game. And that's not mentioning the Genesis version, which Bootleg Games Wiki says is extremely rare. After all the trouble that you'll go through when attempting to play this bootleg, you'll probably wonder to yourself if all the trouble was even worth it. And to be honest, the answer is no, at least in my opinion. This game is fundamentally broken, and it barely responds properly to your inputs, and I also think that it lacks the humorous aspects of the previous games. There are no immediate signs of a rush job or a mistranslation, etc., and it has pretty standard audio too. Like KWF98, the thrill here isn't around for very long, and even though I've been a big fan of the original X-Men vs Street Fighter for over 15 years now I think, well, I quickly lost interest in this game when I was recording footage. I think it'd be better if it kept the 6-button layout of the original and maybe had some more of its characters too, but this is an unofficial bootleg after all, so I wasn't expecting anything big going in. I can't fault it too much though, as any game that lets me play as Wolverine and beat up Ryu will always have a special place in my heart. I've saved the craziest game for last, so I'd suggest preparing yourself for this one. Released for the NES at some point after 1994 and developed by Hummer Team, our friends from the first Bootleg Fighting Games video, AV Bisio Senshi Girl Fighting, I think I pronounced that right, is an all-women's fighting game that features assets that are taken from other games, most notably Hummer Team's very own Street Fighter IV bootleg. When you compare these two games side by side, they look extremely similar, and I believe Bisio Senshi runs on the same engine as their Kart Fighter bootleg, believe it or not. Like the previous games, characters here also have motion inputs, and I chose Chun-Li as my starting character. She only has two special moves, Lightning Legs and Spinning Bird Kick, so I'm very grateful for her ease of use due to me playing all these games on pad. I didn't realize it at first, but after reading through Bootleg Games Wiki, I discovered that every character has only two special moves, and they all have a fireball except for Chun-Li. Not sure why she specifically doesn't have one. In addition to characters and moves being reused between this and Street Fighter IV, a lot of that game's stages and audio return too. It's been around 6 or so months since I last played that game as of recording this video, and I was having serious deja vu because of the shared assets. I kept recognizing certain sound effects and sprites and stages, and it made me feel like I was having some sort of schizophrenic breakdown after a while. Jokes aside, this game is seriously jank, and if I had a choice, I'd rather have X-Men vs Street Fighter Super Nintendo over this. The input reading here is better than something like the King of Fighters 98, but it's still pretty unresponsive half the time, and I sometimes struggle trying to get basic moves out. The hit detection is also frustratingly broken, and I swear the moves just don't connect sometimes for no reason. I'm also not sure if this is due to the emulator I'm using, but there is a crap ton of sprite flickering in the game. It doesn't matter if you walk, jump, attack, block, etc., because the sprites will start flickering like crazy, and it gets really distracting really quickly. Now that you have a basic idea of what the game is like, allow me to dive into the AV part of the game's title. Every time you finish a round in arcade mode, the game rewards you with a hentai image of a near-naked anime girl. These range from partial nudity to full-on NSFW, and I obviously can't show these to you in the video, or else YouTube will sell my entire family into slavery. I thought that these images would start out fairly tame and get more risque over time, but the first image you see has pixelated boobs, so I guess the developers of this game weren't messing around. This part of the game reminds me a lot of the infamous Street Fighter 2, which I also covered in the first video, but at least that game is kind of fun to play. If you're playing the arcade mode here in this game, like me, you'll quickly realize that the enemy AI is super busted. It constantly reads your inputs and it can hit you with the most confusing looking moves in any fighting game ever, so I had no idea how to consistently beat the game's levels. At least you get to play as all the characters on the screen here, and they're all easy to pick up and play, which I like. Okay, let's be honest, the real appeal of this game is its adult content, and I can't see anyone actually playing this game for any other reason. One thing that I genuinely think is hilarious is that if you play the game on an easy difficulty, there is no NSFW imagery. If you really want to see pixelated TNA, then you've got to legitimately beat the game on medium difficulty or above. Or you could just put in a cheat code on the main menu if you don't want to do it properly. Some of this stuff is more explicit than some actual games with adult content that I've played, and even though it isn't realistic at all, there's something slightly unnerving about these revealing anime girls being on screen with the game's really upbeat 8-bit music playing in the background. I found all this really funny at first, but then I noticed that a lot of this artwork features the girls with distressed facial expressions, and one of them was even crying. Look, I'm not a prude or anything, but that was a bit weird, and I'm glad that this is just pixel art and nothing realistic. I feel the need to say, however, that the art itself in these segments is actually quite good. The sprites have a lot of detail, and they even have shading to represent different light sources, so this has got to be some sort of technological achievement for the NES of all systems. Out of all of the games we've covered in this video, I think this game is definitely the wildest, and I'm so happy that no one walked in my room when I was recording footage. What started out as innocent haha fun bootleg time turned into suggestive NES hentai, so I think it's safe to say that we've definitely gone on a thrill ride of sorts for the last 15 or so minutes. Out of all the games we covered, I'd say that X-Men vs Street Fighter is definitely my favorite of the bunch. Even though I said it's not worth the trouble of finding and setting the game up, I can't hate a game that has the X-Men in it, and it's cool how the bootleg has super moves, I guess. If you're interested in trying these games out, I recommend doing so. They're pretty easy to play if you know how, and you can have some fun playing them all with friends. The total lack of production values that these games possess is really funny, and if you like games that are jank, I recommend experiencing these. Man, it's so cool how these anonymous hackers figured out how to make games for these old systems before the internet was widely accessible, and as aftermarket games are really popular in some regions around the world, I have no doubt that many people have played all of these games before. Okay, I'm out of things to say by now, and I'm sure you get the point, so thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.